Welcome back, everyone, to the special business meeting for the District of Squamish for Tuesday, March 1st. We're on to item 4, staff reports. And first up, sorry, we're just sorting out a technical issue. Okay, I think we're good. First up is the alternative approval results report for bylaw 2845. And Ms. Pollock is here to speak with council. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Council. My name is Charlene Pollock. I'm the Manager of Legislative Services, and I'm here today to present on the alternative approval results report for bylaw 2845. I'm here to present on the alternative approval results report for bylaw number 2845, and that's the Squamish Public Works Facility Loan Authorization bylaw. So some information about background and timeline. So the bylaw was given first 3 readings on September 7th, received approval from the Inspector of Municipalities on November 5th. Statutory resolutions to establish the AAP process were passed by Council on December 7th, and that was to establish the deadline and the 10% eligible voters, which is 1,469. And notices were placed in the chief newspaper on December 9th and 16th. So those were the notices required by statute. And then there was an additional ad that ran on January 6th. And February 4th at 4:30 was the elector response deadline. So counter petition forms received, 1,695 valid counter petition forms were received. There was a higher number, but some were not valid, so they were removed from that number. The threshold established for 10% of the electors, as I mentioned, is 1,469. So in conclusion, more than 10% of the electors responded opposing adoption of the borrowing bylaw. Therefore, Council cannot consider adoption of bylaw 2845 unless elector approval is received. So long-term borrowing options and elector approval. So one option is to not proceed with borrowing for the Public Works Facility project. And then there are 2 options with assent, proceeding to assent voting. So proceeding to assent vote, which is known as a referendum, within 80 days of the AAP deadline. No additional Inspector of Municipalities approval would be required if that was the path chosen. The deadline is very tight. I believe it would be April 29th. 80 days following the February 4th deadline. And the cost is significant to run assent voting on its own, given that the local government election is in October. So another option with assent voting is to proceed past the 80 days and hold assent voting on general voting day on October 15th. A new borrowing bylaw would need to be drafted by staff and then to receive first 3 readings and then be submitted to the inspector for approval. For assent voting on general voting day, an explanation would need to be provided to the Inspector of Municipalities as to why the municipality was unable to go to vote within 80 days. I think that would be pretty clear explanation given that the election is in October. And the assent voting question would need to be established by resolution or bylaw. So that's another step that would be required. So I did reach out to the ministry with some questions around AAP and assent voting. And they advise that there is another option if an AAP process fails in addition to assent voting. So there is the option to go out to AAP again. The legislation does not specify a time frame. I was told that it is best practice to amend the scope of the original bylaw to address concerns and or to increase public information and consultation efforts. So if an AAP process is reinitiated, communication efforts would need to be robust and take place well in advance of the AAP process in order to provide information to the public with respect to the project and to address questions and concerns from the public from the previous AAP process. So estimated costs for assent voting and the AAP process. So costs have been laid out in the council report, kind of broken down. So assent voting on election day, minimum 19,000. A lot of that is around communication to the public. Assent voting within 80 days of the AAP deadline. So that would be, I believe the date was April 29th. It would have to be by April 29th. That's the highest cost. That would be a minimum of 52,000. So that includes, you know, all of the costs to run an election, staffing on the day, you know, preparation beforehand, room rental, voting machines, all of that. If an AAP process is reinitiated, there would be costs associated with communication, outreach efforts, and advertising. So that is it for my presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions. The staff recommendation for today is just to receive the report for information. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Pollock. And council, for both this report and the next report, it is just to receive. Obviously, that's at council's discretion, but this is a lot of information to take in. And this report plus the next one has impact on our financial planning and long-term capital planning. So we wanted to give council sufficient time to digest this information and consider their decision rather than being put on the spot today. So that's why these reports are here, for your information. Opportunity to ask questions. We can certainly have a discussion, but didn't want to force your hand today, given the depth of information and the impact that it has. Councillor Race.
Thank you. I was just wondering, how is the number of qualified electors established and how is that updated? And for example, we just received results of the census, which showed a significant population increase in Squamish over the past 5 years. And if we went to AAP again, would that be taken into account in setting the number of qualified electors?
Through the mayor, the number was established from the number of voters at the last local government election because we didn't have the census data. If another AAP is established, we will be taking that into account. And I do have the latest voters list with the number of voters on there, so would be taking that into account as well.
And that would be a higher number. Is it a number you can share today?
Through the mayor, I believe the number on the voters list was around 16,000. I can't remember the exact number, but yes, it is higher.
Other questions? Councillor Petgill.
Yeah, I'm just wanting to understand, there's some staff estimates to providing information if however this goes out again. And the estimate seemed very low. Now it does, I think it says 15,000 minimum. So there's that, I guess, wiggle room, but I'm wondering why the minimum even isn't higher. I guess, you know, when I look at Facebook, you can see what the ad spend is. And, you know, there's been, I would say, some purposeful campaigning at a high price. And so if we're going to counteract that, you know, we are restricted, thankfully, to putting out accurate information, whereas some of the other stuff we've seen does not have that restriction. So I would expect our spend to have to be quite a bit more to counteract. So I'm just wondering if staff can speak a bit to how realistic is that $15,000 communications number, so that the public sort of really understands what this is about and what the consequences are.
Through the mayor, that is an estimate, and I suspect that is low. You know, if there is a decision to proceed, we'll have to look into this further and work with communications and other staff to come up with a more accurate number.
Councillor Herford and then Councillor French.
Thank you. I was curious, the forms submitted, do they have comments to help us all understand what it is, or is it a yes and no? I just haven't actually seen the piece, so I'm just curious if there's any other information to scrape from this with what was provided so far.
Through the mayor, no, there's no opportunity for electors to put comments on the form. They just sign their name that they're not in favor of the bylaw moving forward.
Councillor French.
Thanks, Mayor. Wondering if we could get a little insight into the process for creating a referendum question if council ultimately goes in that direction. Does council create the wording, and is that then reviewed by the provincial government? Can we get like a high-level quick referendum 101?
Through the mayor, I think that Ms. Arthurs and I would come forward with a recommendation on a question, and it would be a very clear yes or no question. That's right. It can be established by bylaw or resolution. And yeah, we would probably, you know, work with the ministry on that before coming forward with the recommendation.
Okay, and if you were to attach a bit of a timeline for how long it would take to put all that together and come back to council, is it something that could be done in a week, or are we talking a month and a half?
Through the mayor, that piece wouldn't take a lot of time. At this point, if assent voting was held on general voting day in October, we've got a fairly long runway. Probably the longer piece would be drafting of a new borrowing bylaw, and then that would need to be sent to the Inspector of Municipalities for approval to move forward with assent voting. And there's timing around that. So that is typically the approval would be 80 days before assent voting. So we do have some time.
Ms. Arthurs.
And just to be clear, that although the report does speak to the April 29th date as an option, I would put that in quotes. That's 80 days from February 4th. And in order for us to move to assent voting earlier in the spring, we would have to prepare ballots. We would have to have the question approved. We would have to secure machines. We would have to train staff and get staff. We would have to establish the advanced voting dates. And normally what happens is if you are fairly certain that your loan authorization, if council wants to go to an AAP, but you know, you're sort of filling it out and certain that it's going to go to an assent vote, that is already lined up ahead of time. And that's what the 80 days, like it would kick in. So from the deadline date, in our case, it was February 4th, it's 80 days from there. We were not prepared. So that's why option is in quotes, because I don't know how we would pull off a referendum on April 29th, to be quite honest. It would be a miracle.
I have no further questions, but I will add context to my question in sharing that I'm not asking the questions from the thinking that we need to have a referendum soon. I'd be thinking general election day.
I wonder if staff can speak to if we chose to change the scope or do something differently with the borrowing bylaw. If there's any recommendation on timing so as not to make it an election issue. I think it's one thing to seek assent for a new recreation center, but this is a critical facility that has critical infrastructure we need to move out of the floodplain, and it doesn't particularly garner public interest, but we can't deliver our core services like clean water and taking care of wastewater and managing the day-to-day operations of the district without it. So if we did another AAP and we did not want it to become an election issue, what is the time frame that we might be looking at?
I think the sooner the better for it to not be an election issue. We would need to put together a chronology, a timeline for our communication and getting the word out to the staff and educate, or out to the public and educating on what the need is, what the critical issues are, and then running the AAP itself, which is approximately 6 weeks, just while the ballots are out there. It's 30 working days, is it? 30 working days, not calendar days. So it's about 6 weeks. And so if you do that puts it into May probably right now. So the sooner the better.
And then if, for instance, we did go to an assent vote, like a referendum with general voting day, if that failed, is then the only alternative for the next council would then be to create another AAP.
So if this goes to assent voting and it fails, the municipality has the option to do another assent vote 6 months later.
Or a different AAP bylaw, or you can only do assent voting from there on out.
That is something I would have to look into, whether if assent fails, whether AAP would be an option or not. But I do know that the legislation provides that you'd have to wait 6 months for another assent vote.
Councillor Pettengill and then Reese.
So if I'm reading the staff report correctly, it looks like if we were to fund this by property tax instead of borrowing, which the AAP would have allowed, the property tax hit is about 7 times as much. Is that correct?
We're getting to that report next. Councillor Reese.
Thank you. If we went back to Ms. Arthur's comments, if we went out to a second AAP, and I believe Ms. Pollack said the best practice is to somehow change the bylaws. So presumably we change the number perhaps and the funding model or something like that. Does that require then the first 3 readings? Basically, we just abandon this bylaw and start right from fresh again. But we can do the 3 readings in one night if we wanted to, so that doesn't really by itself slow us down a lot. Yep.
That is correct.
Any other questions on the AAP process or what our potential next steps are? And all our conversations today are linked. So as you get new information, you might have questions again about the AAP process, and that's fine. We can bring staff back into the conversation. Okay. Ms. Pollock, thanks very much. Motion to receive, moved by Councillor Stoner, seconded by Councillor Herford. Any comments? All right, seeing none, I'll call the question. Any opposed? Motion carries. So now we're moving on to our next item, and this is the presentation related to our previous discussion on the Public Works Facility financing funding options as a result of the failure of our alternative approval process. So I am turning it over to our CFO, Ms. Boxrud. And what is your title, Mr. Russell? Director?
No,
Super smart guy who makes our budget process so easy?
I like that, but it's a little long. I believe the appropriate term is senior financial analyst.
I knew it had senior in it. Thank you for joining us today. I'll turn it over to you to take us through this report.
Ready to go? Yeah, excellent. Thank you. Good afternoon, Mayor and Council and members of the community that have joined us today. My name is Heather Boxer, Chief Financial Officer, and I will be reviewing the options to fund the construction of the Public Works facility with you today. As Mayor Elliott noted earlier, the objective is to review and consider the funding options, and there is no recommendation in front of you today. Recognizing that this is a complicated and nuanced decision, therefore staff will bring back a recommendation in a few weeks back to council, giving council some time to consider the information. The agenda of the presentation is I will provide a brief background as Ms. Paula covered the alternative approval process in detail in the previous presentation, but in case some of the public are joining us now. And then we'll provide a summary of the viable funding options that were outlined in the council package. We will then open it up for discussion and questions. Joining me today are Mr. Bragg, the district's Director of Facilities and Planning and Construction, and Mr. Russell, Senior Financial Analyst, are joining me today to assist in the discussion and answer any questions. So just to add a brief history, the Public Works facility is one of 3 facilities, along with the 2 fire halls that were identified in the Real Estate and Facilities Strategy and Master Plan as a critical need of immediate replacement. The financial analysis and capital plan modeling determined that a combination of borrowing and land reserve were the most cost-effective with the least impact on the taxpayer for the district to raise the funds necessary to pay for the project in the immediate time frame required to replace the facility. The facility was then incorporated into the 2021 to 2025 financial plan and then updated again in the 2022 to 2026 financial plan as the project advanced through the construction budget estimate process. The 2021 work plan included the construction cost estimation process, the facility scope and design planning, and securing the financing for the project, which includes the 6-month lengthy process to ensure borrowing in accordance to the legislation and through the Municipal Finance Authority, or MFA. As well, important to the timeline is there are only 2 intake periods for annual issuance of borrowing funds. So it is critical that the financing is secured before the commencement of the construction, including any contract commitments. The 2022 work plan includes scope finalization, budget finalization, and commencing the facility construction. So as such, in 2021, the district began the loan authorization process to secure the financing for the project. Pursuant to the community charter, authorization to enter into a long-term borrowing bylaw number 2845 was given 3 readings and subsequently approved by the municipal inspector. This bylaw was then subject to an electoral approval process, and the district commenced the alternative approval process. So as Ms. Pollock mentioned, if more than 10% of eligible electors submit response forms in opposition to the bylaw, council must decide whether to move approval to an assent or referendum voting, or whether to abandon the bylaw. The bylaw received 1,695 valid response forms and exceeded the 10% threshold. So at this stage, the district has 2 paths to take, or 2 options to move the bylaw forward to assent voting or referendum within 80 days, or to explore other options. Today, I will be reviewing the financial other options with council. So the first viable financial option, which is the recommended financial tool in the current financial plan, is to utilize the borrowing service offered to local governments through the Municipal Finance Authority. It is important to note that MFA's service is a valuable and effective financing option for municipalities that can be utilized to spread the cost of the project over the project's useful life, which in turn allows the cost of the facility to be paid by the taxpayer that benefits the most from the asset. The MFA also pools the borrowing of BC municipalities in order to provide a low-cost financing option and pays interest to the municipalities on the payments, the principal payments made. Utilizing this low-cost financing mechanism also hedges and stabilizes against the construction cost inflation, which, as we know, is on the rise. The annual cost of borrowing of the required $18 million for the project in the Class 1 residential taxpayer is $9.50 per 100,000 of assessed property value, and $24 per 100,000 of the Class 6 business property assessment to the property owner. This option requires the district to go back and pursue electoral approval through either the AAP or the assent vote, as outlined in Ms. Pollock's previous report. In terms of property tax, the municipalities have the authority to fund projects and services through property tax and forego other options, including borrowing, in order to raise the $18 million in revenue required to fund the public works facility without delaying the project. The district would require 50% of the project's funds in 2022, and then the remaining 50% in 2023. This 2-year tax scheme would have an annual cost to the Class 1 residential owner of $68 per 100,000 of assessed property value, or $175 per 100,000 for Class 6 business property owners. The third option would be the sale of municipal assets to raise the funds. This option would require a full reprioritization of the 10-year capital plan and could have significant impacts to future projects. As well, the sale of the municipal assets could take time and would be required by the end of 2022 in order not to incur project delays. Finally, a combination of the 3 funding options could also occur. However, cash flow timing requirements, potential project delays, and all the other implications outlined should also be considered. Borrowing would still be required to achieve the 10-year capital plan as it stands today. So municipalities have additional funding options available. However, for legislative reasons or eligibility requirements, they are not appropriate for the public works facility. And I'll just briefly mention what those are. So firstly, short-term borrowing. This option is reserved for smaller projects with small borrowing needs. Legislation maximizes the borrowing capabilities to $50 times the population of the municipality, which equates to approximately 1.2 million for the district. And that's a balance of 1.2 million, not an issuance or an annual issuance. In terms of the general and capital reserves, insufficient funds exist in both of those reserves. Therefore, the utilization of any portion of these funds would displace other projects, put the district at risk of infrastructure replacement delays, service delivery challenges, and expose the district to risk of having insufficient cash for working capital or emergencies, as well as for internal borrowing of smaller debt-funded projects without the temporary borrowing capabilities. The interfund borrowing option, so borrowing between the utility funds and the general fund, should be utilized only in emergencies and only for short-term cash flow needs. Municipalities do have the ability to lease facilities. However, the public works facility's unique attributes would make the lease considered a capital lease. Therefore, it would be classified in the capital lease program and be subject to all the debt servicing capacity and the AUP or assent process. The public works facility is also not eligible for DCC or development cost charge funding. And we have no known grants available to the public works facility today. Finally, given the significant size and relatively immediate requirement for financing to construct the facility, moving, deferring, canceling the projects to generate the funds required would require a significant upheaval of the 5-year and 10-year financial plans. As well, opportunity for significant deferral or cancellation of projects, particularly in the next 1 to 2 years that is required for the public works facility, would cause disruption of the master plan implementations and infrastructure replacement cycles. And that's all I have for you today. Thank you, everyone. And I will turn it over to council for discussion and any questions you might have for myself, Mr. Russell or Mr. Bragg.
Okay, so council, this afternoon, Mr. Bragg is coming back to talk about the full scope of the Public Works facility. And so I don't want to get into that discussion at this time because we can explore it this afternoon. But if there are tangential questions that Mr. Bragg can answer, he can do that today. So we really would just want to focus on understanding the impact and the options in front of us. Go ahead, Councillor Reyes.
Thank you. So I guess there's a whole bunch of different options out there, but just on the taxation thought, you had an example for 1 year or 2 years of raising the whole amount. Is it possible to say stretch it out over 3 or 4 years? Is there some way to interim fund the first part of it? Use reserves for something up front, for example, to get the project going? Are those types of options available to us?
In order, through the chair, sorry, in order to fund, if you were to fund completely from the taxation and in any of the funding mechanisms without delaying the project, it would be required, the money, the cash would be required by the end of the first year. So that determines whether or not you can, do the tax scheme longer than 2 years. If you could fund 50% of the overall project, so $9 million, you could potentially smooth the taxation over another year or so. However, that would require, again, a full reschedule of the 5-year financial plan. There really isn't a lot of movement capability within the 5-year plan and the 10-year plan right now to move the funding around.
When you say if you could fund over 50%, in other words, the first half, if you came up with other resources to cover the $9 million approximately, then you could use taxation over maybe 2 years or 3 years for the balance. Is that what you meant by that?
Over 2 years at maximum. But again, looking at that would have a knock-on effect to other projects in the 5-year plan and the 10-year plan if you're using any combination of other resources. So it'd be a bit of a shuffle.
Councillor Stoner?
Thank you. Through the chair, I'm just wondering if staff can just speak to the timeline a little bit more. Obviously, this is a critical facility that's been identified for need of immediate replacement, but what happens if we do put it off by a year? What is driving the timeline, and what other projects potentially get pushed if this gets pushed out?
Through the chair, I can dive into that a little bit further this afternoon. We've estimated if we push it off for 1 year, it's approximately a $1.5 million cost. And that's looking at escalation from this year's prices in construction to next year, and also some stopping and starting costs. And that's a rough estimation to give you an indicative estimate.
And just to follow up on that, are there other projects that would then also be delayed as a result? What is the knock-on effect on the other projects that are in the 5-year financial plan?
Through the chair, that's a good question. We haven't fully explored that one yet. The impact will be, we've got the wastewater treatment plants working next door, and we need to create a management plan of how the two projects then work together. Because initially we had both the projects working side by side to have economies of scale. And if one's not moving ahead for a year, then it changes everything. We don't have a finalized scope on that, but there is definitely impact there.
Thank you. That's helpful. And then another question just with regards to the proposal, we had suggested using about 16 million in borrowing, and that wasn't the full cost of the estimated project. And so what were the other areas of funding that we were already pulling from?
The funding was a combination of land reserve and debenture borrowing.
There is some work that staff are recommending proceeds to the tune of $650,000 to move the salt sheds and go ahead with the site preload. So 2 questions, one for finance, where is that money coming from? And then second, if we move the salt sheds and preload, can we still have a functional public works yard? Thank you.
So to answer the first question, the existing budget that is approved has a funding combination of debt, which has not been approved, and land reserve, which has been authorized by council. We would use the land reserve.
Through the chair, it's a good question. We've spoken to operations to make sure that we can keep operations or business as usual. With the preload, it's about 1.2 to 1.5 meters high. We can actually park on top of that and store items. So it is a usable area once it's sitting on there. And with the salt sheds, that's an upper cost as well for the salt sheds. If we do that, it puts us in a position to come into this winter where we've got one usable salt shed, and also allow for space for the wastewater treatment plant to go ahead as well, because it's a very tight site. So we propose we need to move the salt sheds to at least get both sites and getting some construction going, because the wastewater treatment plant is obviously extremely important to keep the timelines this year. So the impact for the preload is minimal, because we can park on it. There's obviously be impact a little bit from the construction side for timing as we put it on, but we can work on top of it.
Councillor Pangill.
Yeah, I want to avoid getting into a discussion that I believe we're going to see some future reports on this, but my understanding is with climate change, there may be more severe winter weather or maybe no snow anymore, but we need to be prepared. It sounds like some legislative changes too. So with raising the site or starting this work, do we have the capacity? I mean, I heard business as usual mentioned, but do we have the capacity for additional snow clearing if that is going to be required? Or are we sort of capped at where we've been?
Through the chair, I can't answer that one. I'll have to talk to Public Works to answer that one. Apologies.
Any questions about the different financing options. And just on this slide that's up, Ms. Boxer, those are the numbers per $100,000 worth of assessment, correct? So the number is over $1,000 per year for some folks.
That is correct.
We should probably do the math for people. Councilor Vace?
Well, it was more a matter of process, and I'm just wondering where we go from here. I take the point we're not going to make a decision today. We want to kind of chew this over. But do we have any sort of tentative schedule about when this might come back to us and we might start kicking around options and things of that nature?
Through the chair, yes, I believe this is on the April 5th agenda. Is that correct, Chair? Yeah, April 5th agenda.
Maybe to follow up on that before I go to Councilor Herford, Mr. Bragg, you were just talking about how tightly knit the wastewater treatment plant and the public works building were sort of knit together to get opportunities of scale and that sort of thing to actually save us money. So what do you feel is the timeline for our decisions to make sure that that can still happen? Or at what point do we put that at risk?
Yeah, through the chair, that's a hard one to answer. And the best answer I can give right now is the sooner we get to a decision, the better we can, because we have consultants, we have builder about to come on board and be contracted. So ideally, if I put my construction hat on, a month at latest.
Councilor Herford.
Thank you. And I have a question. I think it's along the same timeline or the same line, but with the information you have now and the funding that's provided, are you at a standstill, or are you proceeding with the preload work, or is that our decision in about a month? I just wasn't sure where that piece was, or if staff felt that they were still okay to move forward as far as they could at this point.
Through the chair, we're continuing to operate per existing timelines until we get direction to change that.
Councilor Pettengill.
So we have within our growth management boundary land zoned for development. And so that sort of can go ahead in some form or another. In terms of building out, in the future, we will probably expand beyond our boundary. Do we have that capacity with the current sort of site? Or I'm just trying to understand, like, if we said, hey, we're okay with staying in the floodplain, do we have that capacity on that site for growth beyond our boundary? Or is this a limiting factor?
Through the chair, we've designed the whole project around the flood levels and flood risk. We've mitigated that, and I'll go through in a little bit more detail this afternoon. The site is smaller with the allowance with the allowance of the future growth for the wastewater treatment plant. We still have some room to move in the future. We've actually got a bay that we've put on the side there. And again, I'll go through in a little bit of detail to allow for some future growth. So whilst the site is smaller than we originally anticipated, we've still got some allowance for future growth.
Councilor Stoner.
Thank you. Staff mentioned that DCCs are not a viable funding alternative for this, and can you just speak to why that is?
DCCs are regulated by the provincial government. The provincial government allows DCCs to fund infrastructure, in-ground assets. It does not permit DCCs to fund above-ground assets. It's basically that simple.
I know we talk about the impact this is going to have depending on the decision council makes. But when you say funding this project differently has a knock-on effect and could reorganize our 10-year capital plan and certainly our 5-year financial plan, what is the level of work that would be involved? Like, where are we going back to? Because this council has spent the better part of the last 3 years carefully working with staff on building out the real estate and facilities master plan and supporting the development for the first time of a 10-year capital plan to give our community a view to what the future looks like. And so where do we have to go back to if we move away from long-term borrowing or go in a different direction for this project? Are we going back to the beginning?
Through the mayor, sorry about that interruption. I won't say we're going back to the beginning, but we would be, I guess there's a number of different ways to look at this. It would depend on what decisions were made about the type of refinancing that we were looking at. As Ms. Boxrud pointed out, the ability to access funds, say through the capital reserve, or to share funds from the capital reserve to help fund this building would require a major reconstruction of our financial plan. We have probably $3 or $4 million worth of funding coming out of the capital reserve in the next 2 to 3 years, lots of roofs for other buildings, as an example. That would probably have to be deferred or perhaps not proceed. So we would get to the point where we would start to put other infrastructure at risk by having to reshuffle funding from the capital reserve. Funding from the land reserve is being used to fund a number of other projects within both the 5-year plan and the 10-year plan, longer term plan. And so we would then have to, if we wish to use more funding from the land reserve, we would have to look at accelerated asset sales, and we would also have to look at the potential to defer some of those other projects out into the future. I'm not going to suggest that we would defer the second fire hall, but that is one of the projects that's using land reserve financing in the next few years. There are a number of smaller projects that are at Brenham Park, for example, smaller facilities that are deemed critical that are basically falling apart that need to be replaced, and we had intended to use land reserve to finance those. Those could be in jeopardy if we had to use land reserve financing for public works.
Thank you for that. And I know when we were in our discussions about the real estate and facilities master plan and how to prioritize and fund those projects, we spent a lot of time explaining to the community the difference between critical, core, and other. And I wonder if there's someone here today or someone that can come back this afternoon as part of Mr. Bragg's project to reiterate again why we prioritize 2 fire halls and the public works yard over something like Brenham Park. And I don't know whether that should happen now, if the right people are in the room to do that now, or whether that can be part of the presentation, because I feel like people might have forgotten.
Through the chair, I believe that I can answer most of this question, and I'm sure if there are other pieces that are left unanswered, they could be directed to our manager of real estate this afternoon. The rationale for the rationale for the definitions between critical and core were based on the assessment of need of the facility. And so realistically, what it comes down to is, what does that facility provide? 2 things. 1, what does that facility provide? And 2, what are the types of funding mechanisms that will be available for those facilities to be funded? So the critical facilities are facilities that are required for public safety requirements and also for the requirements of legislative requirements. So public works is required because it supports roadways, water, and wastewater, which are water and wastewater and roads are legislated requirements for the municipality to provide. The fire halls obviously are there to provide public safety requirements, again, which are legislated. So those are the reasons that those three facilities specifically are critical. Although many people in the community might feel that recreational facilities are critical also, they are core facilities because they provide for leisure and entertainment, let's say, as opposed to legislated requirements. The province does not mandate that we have to provide recreation facilities. They do mandate that we have to provide water treatment, wastewater treatment, garbage collection, and roadway maintenance. So that primarily is the differentiation between the requirement for a critical facility and the requirements of a core facility. So recreation facilities are considered core and therefore would be at the next level for replacement.
And perhaps, Mr. Bragg, you can go into this afternoon, but I understand there's some resiliency and life safety issues we're taking care of with the current Public Works building.
Through the chair, there's a simple answer, yes. It's not to code, there's safety issues, there's gender issues there at the moment. It's far from a building that we would have today or at today's standards. The office is still operating out of an old transportable. The maintenance bays are an old steel portal frame that's had shacks put on it as it's grown over time. So it's far below a typical standard building at the moment.
Councillor Stoner?
Just so I get this right, can somebody help me do the math on the tax implications? So it's $135.90 per 100,000. So if I do that right, it's just over $1,300 for $1 million home in the first year. And so that's about a doubling of our current tax requisition for 2022.
I'll do the math slightly differently, if that's okay, Councillor Stoner. I believe the tax on $1 million home is about $2,200. So for municipal, so you'd be looking at about a 2/3 increase over 1 year or a 1/3 increase over 2 years. So $700 per year for 2 years on what is now about $2,300 tax bill. So yes, a very significant increase.
Okay. I'm not seeing any other questions at this time. So the motion on the floor is that council receive the Public Works Building Financial Funding Options Report for information. Moved by Councillor Hertford, seconded by Councillor French. Any further discussion or comments? Councillor Stoner, and then Councillor Reyes.
Thank you. Through the chair, this is a challenging report to receive, both the previous one and this one. And it has given me a lot to think about. I'm happy we're not making a decision on this today. It has significant financial implications for our citizens. If, as our line of questioning just revealed, if we were to move this to tax increase, that's a 2/3 increase this year alone. We can't do that to our population, but we also know that we need this facility really badly. It's in that critical amenities. We're legislatively required to provide these services that building provides. So there's lots of moving pieces here. I think as I think about it in terms of the process that we've gone through and the alternative approvals process, there's some learning here for me with respect to when we move projects forward through the AAP process. As the mayor mentioned, we have lived and breathed the real estate and facilities master plan through our entire term and worked really closely with staff to figure out how we're going to finance that. So we are very familiar with it, but I think maybe one of the missteps was that we didn't communicate that effectively enough to our community before we went out to the alternative approvals process. And I think part of that is that we're just seeing Class D estimates and the design for the building coming this afternoon. And so there's a really big piece of learning here for me in terms of our timing. But I don't think this falls entirely on our shoulders. There was also, I believe, a concerted effort by a group of individuals to campaign against this process and to amplify misinformation around what will happen now that it's not being funded, that money would be coming or would be going to a different project. The reality is that we still need this building. We need to find a way to fund it. And we need to do better in terms of making sure that our communications are up to snuff so that we aren't falling in this trap of misinformation that is leading to critical infrastructure not being built in our community. And so it's challenging. It's challenging to see this process where it is, but some lessons learned on my part, and I will give it some good thought as to how we potentially move it forward. Thanks for staff for the due diligence on what plans A, B, and C are here. As I said, there's lots to think about. Thank you.
Councillor Race and then Herford.
Thank you. And I'll just add to that. This is actually the first time I've run into this in my time on council in the last 14 years, and I can't remember the last time in Squamish this has happened. This is an unusual circumstance, obviously well coordinated by somebody, and I can only say that from my perspective, this building must go ahead before any of the other proposed building projects. The first two are the fire halls. They are a given from my perspective. This is the third one, and this will go ahead somehow before we tackle Brennan Park and the library and other projects like that. It's hard for me to know exactly why this well-coordinated campaign was undertaken. I didn't receive any kind of correspondence from people or emails or anything of the like saying that they're upset with this or upset with that. There is an element in our society today that just seems to like to sow chaos. And we saw that partly in the convoy protests, which started off with one concern and ended up with a whole bunch of different concerns and finally ended up, I think, in the point where they were just happy just to cause problems. And so this is, for me, is sort of the same thing. But I will say without hesitation that whoever organized this is not a friend of Squamish.
Any other comments? As my colleagues have said, it's a lot to take in, and it's really unfortunate that I suppose, there was some information lacking, but also that whoever organized this campaign didn't reach in to get the information they needed. So at least people pushing back were pushing back based on the facts of this project and its intention and what we're trying to do here. This is a democratic process and it's there for a reason. And just over 1,600 people have spoken. The problem for us now as a council to figure out is how do we get this building built? Because the ramifications of these votes by just shy of 1,700 people has deep financial implications for our district. And that is the reason why we didn't want to push council to a decision today. I'm hoping that our community digests this information. I'm hoping that our community reaches in and asks some questions and speaks with council about their thoughts about where we should go on this and how to move this forward and when to move it forward. So we have issues of timing, financing, and this afternoon we're talking about the project and its scope so that it can accommodate growth. So there's so much at play here. And in an era of misinformation, we can always do better and we can own that. I think we've, as Councillor Ray said, this has never happened in his 4 terms on office. Can't remember a time that it happened on council in the district. But I guess we're at a place where we can't take that for granted anymore. And we'll have to pay more attention to our AAP process if this is how the community wants to deal with them. But it doesn't accelerate other projects. We still don't have the money. We were asking to borrow money. So it's not like there's $16 million there that we can just put towards something else. This is something that was baked into a very thoughtful and strategic plan so that we could catch up on the infrastructure deficit that we're under, like many communities. So I thank staff for their reports. They were clear. They provided us some good information that we can mull over. And I do hope our community will engage with us on this topic as we move towards a decision. So I'll call the question. Any opposed? Motion carries. Thank you very much. I think we can terminate the meeting. Motion to terminate. Moved by Councillor Stoner, second by Councillor Herford. Any opposed? Motion carries. And we are back at what time? 2:15. So let's see people back at 2:15. Thank you.